Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so pleased that you can be with us. My name is Ann Wallestead. I am President and CEO of BoardSource, and I am going to be joined momentarily, here we are, by Alice Antonelli from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. I apologize for the technical glitch. I wasn't able to get on video and share slides with you at the same time, but really we don't have any slides today because what we want to do is have a conversation with you about the board's role in leading through crisis. I just want to start by acknowledging that when we envisioned this session, the crisis that we had in mind and that we were thinking about was the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, here we find ourselves in a moment where we have crisis upon crisis. And so I just want to acknowledge that we might all be navigating through what that means for ourselves as leaders and as humans, and for what it means for our organizations, our staffs, and the people and communities that we care about. So as Alice and I thought about today's session, what we really wanted to do was to create space to have the conversation that's most important to all of you, and that is relevant to the challenges and issues that you're facing right now in terms of the shared leadership between boards and staffs. So we're going to start by just each doing kind of a super brief self-introduction, and then we're going to shift into what we consider a fishbowl conversation, which is the two of us chatting a little bit about some things that we think might be of interest and relevant to what you're experiencing. And our hope is that right off the bat, you will jump into the Q&A and share with us what's on your mind and how you would like to use this time together, the issues and challenges that you are facing if you are museum directors, you know, in terms of partnership with your board, if you're a board member, in terms of the way that you're navigating leadership in some high stakes moments. And then we will make sure that we shift entirely to your questions for the latter portion of our conversation, but we really do hope that it's a conversation with you throughout. So just to kick us off, I mentioned my name is Ann. I'm President and CEO of BoardSource. For those of you who are not familiar with BoardSource, we are a nonprofit organization ourselves that exists for the sole purpose of strengthening leadership, nonprofit leadership at the highest level. So really that partnership between chief executives, executive directors, museum directors, and boards. And we do that by doing research to help understand what is happening within boardrooms, and providing resources and tools to support board change, board development, board action. So let me pause there and invite Alice to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ann, and thanks for everybody who's joining us today. My name is Alice Antonelli, and I am a director at Nonprofit Finance Fund. And for those of you who don't know us, we are headquartered in New York City, and we are a national organization. We like to call ourselves a CDFI, which is an acronym for Community Development Financial Institution. But we do much more than lending. So we started out as a lender, and those are our roots. But we also advise clients and funders, nonprofits as well, in terms of financial issues, strategies, implementation, really anything through that finance lens. We have an advisory practice around that. And then lastly, we also have an advocacy group, which lifts up what we're seeing in the field to you all through surveys or our blogs, you know, all sorts of free resources on our website. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm really excited to join in with Ann to talk about just what's on your mind in terms of board dynamics during a crisis.
Thank you so much. So as we think about, you know, the challenges that I know we both, Alice, are seeing organizations face with, you know, one of the things that I said as we were kind of prepping is, at least from the BoardSource perspective, a lot of what we're seeing are challenges that we saw in boards, a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, sort of those perennial challenges that boards face and that board staff partnerships face in terms of role definition and level of engagement and, kind of, getting those things well calibrated, really understanding how boards can add value and thinking about where they can add the most value and how to get focus there. All things that we hear all the time, but at least from my perspective, in a moment of crisis, which of course we are in, the stakes just get so much higher, and therefore the intensity around any possible frustrations that folks are facing, whether from the executive or director perspective or from the board perspective, just ratchet up really intensely, which can make it really, really challenging in an already challenging situation to feel good about that partnership and to leverage it in ways that are really, really needed right now. So I'd love to just start by, sort of anything you can share about things that you're seeing that might be helpful fodder for conversation here as we hear from folks in the Q&A about specific things that they're facing.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm reading the Q&A as you are talking, and there was one actually that came up about endowment. And I know since there are probably going to be at least 100 people on this call, let's talk about endowment. And let me read. Here we go. So I'm hopeful that today's conversation can touch on navigating conversations about endowment and endowment use during times of crisis. I know many boards and executive staff are faced with questions about this in ways that they've never seen before. And I'll get us started, Anne, and if you want to join in, that'd be great. So in terms of endowment, we at Nonprofit Finance Fund, we really encourage our organizations, rather than set up a very highly restricted endowment fund, that they consider more of a board designated fund, because in times of crisis like this, you can rely on your board and talk to your board and perhaps access those funds if necessary. It's, as you guys know, it's very difficult to do that when you have an endowment that's restricted by outside parties, and the communication with them may be tricky, all sorts of things. So just right off the top of my top of my head, in terms of endowment, think about the future. We can't do anything now if we have an endowment that's permanently restricted by outside parties, but think about the future. And when you add to those endowment funds, perhaps setting aside something that I like to call a quasi-endowment fund, or you could call it a longer-term investment fund. It's meant to be just like an endowment, but it's there and the board has jurisdiction over it rather than outside parties. And so it makes it a little bit more accessible for folks. Having said that, the question was, what do we do now? And really that depends. You'll probably hear that word a lot during this conversation. But it does depend on where you are at this moment in time, right? Do you have resources that are available that are not restricted that you can use to be able to weather this time, right? Do you have access perhaps to a line of credit that would be helpful during this time? Can you do a special appeal and raise money specifically for your need? In some respects, that endowment, because it is permanently restricted, and depending on those outsiders, it's like a break glass sort of thing. You kind of want to wait until you have to break the glass. I'm going to stop there, pass it over to Anne, and see what you think. Anne, what are your thoughts on endowment?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And if I were to add anything, it would simply be, as you've outlined, there are some things that you simply can't touch. And so really the board decision making is around the things that you can. And so if you have resources, whether endowment or reserves, that the board is allowed to touch, then it becomes a question of should we? And if we should, how. And I am seeing lots of boards, who are wrestling with that right now. And I think, generally speaking, I think organizations are right to think about those endowments or those funds, those reserves that they can touch as rainy day funds, but not rainy day without an end fund. So, you think about them somewhat like, at least from my perspective, as do we need this to bridge to the other side of something? But that's really, really tough when you don't know, kind of how far away the other side is. And so those are the things that I'm seeing boards wrestle with, and that you can't answer for someone. There's no set formula. But if it's kind of jumping off the cliff of we're just going to start using reserves and we don't know how far they'll get us, and we're going to hope that they get us far enough, that is a risky place as an organization, because what happens if they run out? And so thinking about, what are they bridging you toward, and how confident are you that they can get you to the other side of that bridge, I think are important questions for boards to wrestle with, and that need to inform the way that you think about use of reserves or endowment funds that are accessible. I
That's
see that
great.
we go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I see that we have a couple of other questions. So I'll tackle what's showing up first on my screen from Marilyn about museums need EDs more than ever, but is it the time for transitions and searches? And Marilyn, that makes me want to ask you a lot of questions about where that might be coming from, because I don't think there's one answer there. So I'm going to go back to Alice's. It depends. I think this is a tough moment for transition, because it is transition on top of transition, because we're all in a transition moment right now, from the kind of pre-COVID reality to the COVID reality. And hopefully there will be, a post-COVID reality that comes soon, but we don't know how far away that is. And so I do think that organizations and boards are faced with, questions about how much change can an organization sustain and handle at once. That said, if change needs to happen, whether because it's time for a director to go and they just don't, have it in terms of the ability to lean into this, or they've got health issues that they're suddenly facing as a result of the pandemic that mean that they need to step back, boards don't have a choice to sort of shy away from transitions that are thrust upon them. And so while it may not be ideal, or it may be more difficult, we are seeing boards that are in that situation, and thinking about, what's the best way for us to think about executive succession from this point forward. One thing, and this is not specific to, operating in the midst of a pandemic and a racial equity crisis, but more generally true, is thinking about executive transition in a way that says, how do we not assume that this institution should continue to exist in exactly the same way before we lean into an executive transition? So we encourage boards to ask big questions when you're in that moment of transition before you lean into search, and say, is this a moment where, different thinking about who we are and what we need to be, partnerships, et cetera, might be appropriate? That's, of course, doesn't assume that the answer is yes, but it's an inflection point in an organization's trajectory that, I encourage boards to pause and think through. What would you add, Alice?
I don't think I would add too much else. I do, I'm mostly going to echo what you said, but transition, as all of us know, and especially for leadership, is not easy. And I don't know if you have any statistics on this, but I think I read somewhere that the first person who comes in after a founder or a long-term executive director, that director may just stay for a year or two. It's a real tough transition. Everybody's breaking each other in, and it's hard. Thankfully, Nonprofit Finance Fund, we had a transition from the founder, And amazingly, it worked out well. It was not during a crisis situation. So I do think change is so hard in just regular times, right? And to think about it during a crisis is very, very challenging. You're just putting an additional thing onto an already very tenuous situation, perhaps. But I do appreciate what you said about, we may have to, right? And especially during COVID, everybody's personal situation is different, right? Maybe you have a director who has small kids and has to homeschool, during this time, and can only provide 50%, or they're working late at night, and it's very, at some point we've got to help our executive directors, whatever situation or whatever they find themselves in. And that actually gets to another question. I know we have a lot of questions in our chat box here, but how about, Anne, where you have the dynamics between the board and the staff board and executive leadership in a time of crisis. And I'll paint two pictures for you. You have the over exuberant board member who just wants to roll up their sleeves and get in and help that executive director that perhaps has to homeschool her kids. Or you have the board member, and this actually happened with me and one of my clients, where one of my colleagues met the board member at a particular meeting, and he was like, I haven't heard at all from my executive leadership. So you've got kind of there's no communication at all, or that exuberant communication. What do you do?
Yeah. So we're seeing both of those things too. And as I said before, those are not uncommon realities in normal times. I think it's just so much more high stakes and so much more challenging to have complete disengagement or to have kind of hyper or over engagement. I think the advice to the director is actually somewhat similar. I think it's really about getting your own clarity in your head as a leader about where you need the board to engage and what you absolutely must have from the board in terms of decision making and engagement. Talking with the board as a group about what those places are, why you need them there. Trying to not necessarily limit, but be intentional about the other asks that you're making of the board, because everybody is, in sort of a moment of intensity, and making individual asks where board members can be really helpful in those places. So kind of limiting the group asks to the things that need to be group decisions, and the board acting as the board, making individual asks of individual board members who can help you in specific ways. I'm thinking about fundraising, advocacy, partnership connections, etc. And I think being explicit about what is not helpful in this moment. So for that over-engaging board member, being willing to say to the board, I'm in a moment of crisis here, and I have to triage how I use my limited time. I've got, and this is not a kind of dumping your bucket, saying everything that you're facing in terms of a challenge, but being honest about, I've got a lot of really tough operational realities that I need to deal with as a leader. And so, this is a moment where great ideas are maybe welcome in terms of long term, but my approach to them is going to be to capture them and come back to them, in a future moment. And kind of the open brainstorming around anything and everything that we might be able to do may just be less helpful in this moment. Now, you may not be in that situation. That might be exactly what you need, but being clear about what is helpful and what isn't helpful. And just to reverse that or invert it and look at it from the board perspective, for that board chair who hasn't heard from the executive or the director, or who is struggling to think about how they can be most helpful or add value, ask. So the advice I would give is to reach out to the executive and say, I'm thinking about you. I care about you. I know that things are really hard right now. Please let me know how we as a board and how I as chair can be most helpful. What do you need? What do you need me to sort of take on? Are there places that, you know, the board has not traditionally played a role? Can we do our own minutes? You know, that I'm spitballing in terms of the specifics, but really listening to what is helpful rather than inserting in a way that may not be. Now, that's not to say that the board can abdicate its responsibility for understanding where is the organization from a situation analysis perspective. So if the board hasn't heard from the director or you know, the CEO about here's what we're facing, here's what our financial reality is, here's what our operational reality is, then the board does need to ask for that. And they need to really understand, what are we looking at as an organization? What is the CEO or museum director thinking about in terms of what that means? So there does need to be communication. It's not a moment where the board can just sit back and say, let's wait to hear what they say.
That's great. So we definitely have a lot of questions. Here's one that actually resonates with me. With so much change and so much uncertainty in the short term, how should an organization be thinking about strategic or long-range planning? Our organization was getting ready to begin a planning process. We've temporarily put it on pause, but I'm thinking it may be quite a while before it makes sense to address long-term planning. What are your thoughts? So this is actually the first client that I thought of is a client of mine down in Texas, and we were hired specifically to do growth planning for them. And then COVID hit, and everything just, they didn't have to go on complete shutdown, but because of stay-at-home restrictions, they were actually considered essential, and so they could remain open, but they didn't have that much volume. And their business model, as the business model with a lot of the museums, really requires people to come in and pay for services. So it was a really challenging time. They didn't have too much in reserves, and we had to figure out cash flow planning and all of that. The good news is that we knew it was going to be temporary. In some respects, for this organization, yes, it was temporary. They're back open, or the stay-at-home orders have been released. People are now flooding their facilities. And so now, you know, it's a matter of paying attention to volume. So we are, you know, we had to push pause on our growth planning, but now we're re-engaging on the planning. Again, there's that word depends. I mean, that was one situation. With another client of mine up in Massachusetts, they were not planning, you know, they weren't doing too much planning at all. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. Alrighty. So they weren't doing too much long-range planning, but now they're going into serious short-term mode. So again, we were hired prior to COVID, and we kind of pivoted on what we're doing. And so now we're definitely looking at planning, and we're looking at it on a quarterly basis. This organization is super, just the executive director is very inspirational. She's a very creative thinker. She's got a lot of different ideas, and we're going to look at them on a quarterly basis. So in terms of like board and planning, I think, again, it depends on who you are and where you are. But pushing pause is not a bad idea, but what can we do in the short term? You know, can we look at planning in the short term and do it in chunks, right? You know, quarterly, maybe next 6 months. Anne, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I guess what I would say is, and this is probably more definitive than it should be, but I do think that generally a moment of crisis is probably not the right time to do long-term planning. I think it's probably just not the best place to spend time and energy, and it's going to likely change. That said, if an organization is in a place where they truly don't have a sense of organizational direction and what is most important for them to be focused on, even in the short term, it probably does make sense for the board to spend a little time reflecting on the question, what is our core purpose? Why are we here? What's most important for us to do? So that the director or the chief executive can build short-term plans and priorities that flow from a shared understanding of what that core purpose or top, sort of organizational priority is, rather than being sort of rudderless trying to navigate through crisis. Now that's different for different organizations. If you're a museum that has a very clear, purpose and mandate, that's probably not such a relevant question. But if you're an organization that has come to the end of a strategic plan and are genuinely asking big questions about, what's most important for us to do, who are we as an organization, it's pretty tough to navigate through crisis without answering some of those at a pretty basic level. But I could talk about this for a long time and I won't, but I think this is a moment where you feel the value of strategic frameworks rather than strategic plans. And what I mean by that in terms of the difference is a framework is really a framework that says, here's what's most important for us as an organization, rather than a mapped out plan of here are all the specific strategies and tactics that we're going to deploy over the next 3 to 5 years. A framework allows you to be responsive to changes in your environment in a way that a strategic plan does not, or does not as naturally. And so even when you get to that place of doing that long-term planning, I really like to encourage boards to think not about how are we going to map it all out, but how are we going to get clear on what's most important and what we're really aiming for in terms of navigating a step-by-step plan to get there.
That's great. And we're getting a lot of questions related to DEIA, depending on how you define it. I'm going to put forth 2 questions. So one was perhaps a more general question about DEAI initiatives and good resources to help boards plan for institutional change. So that's number 1. The next one is, what kind of leadership can a board provide on DEI values during an equity crisis to support staff? And yeah. I just want to say, I attended the earlier session this morning. I believe it was, the name of the session was something about board ethics. I would highly recommend, especially Lynn, for you that are interested in resources, that is a really great place to start. The recording, I'm sure, is available. It provided 4 different folks that had very structured presentations, lots of resources, and at least 2 out of the 4 really provided a lot of information on diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. So number 1, I would go to that recording, and it was earlier this morning, 11 o'clock my time, 10 Central. So, Anne, I know you guys probably have a wealth of information.
We do, and so I would encourage folks, if you're looking for specific resources for boards, we do have a number of resources on the BoardSource website. It's boardsource.org. I know AAM does as well. That could be very practical, helpful tools. I think at a more fundamental philosophical level, if boards have not had a conversation about what diversity, inclusion, access, and equity mean for your organization, what it means to sort of have an absence of diversity, or to not be focused on accessibility, or to not be focused on inclusion and equity, what you lose as an institution, what you're missing out on, what you're saying to your community. I think that those are fundamental questions that boards need to tackle and really understand before you can have meaningful action happen. Because if you just start doing things and you don't really understand why you're doing them as a board, and you haven't made meaning of that as a collective, um, I think it doesn't stick. I think it doesn't come across as authentic because I don't think you know why you're doing it. And so I would say start where you need to start. You know, for those boards that have done that work and are saying, okay, what's next? What's more? What can we do? How can we rise to this occasion? I think those are all great questions to be asking. I think there's a lot that organizations and institutions can do to provide leadership in this moment. But my opinion, you know, not meant to be rude or disrespectful to anyone, a statement without knowing why you're making it or what it means to you as an institution and why you deeply believe the things that you're saying is not the right move.
And I would just put in my own experience. I've been at Nonprofit Finance Fund for 18 years now, and I want to say maybe the last 6 to 8 years as an institution, we've been working on this. And I could say a number of things. One, it's a journey, right? I like, Anne, what you say, you know, you have to meet people where they are. And as a collective, we're all in different places.
Yeah.
All in different places. And as you know, whether training for staff or board or both, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really difficult, but it is important. And obviously we have to do it. But I appreciate what you said about you really have to know and understand why. And you have to be very careful. So,
which is not to say you shouldn't do it, because you should.
Yeah,
we all should. It's so incredibly important for us to understand as organizations really the potential harm that we're doing when we don't understand our community, when we don't have the perspectives that we need around the board table to make sense of things. You know, this is a moment where a lot of boards are really ill-equipped to understand what's happening and what does it mean for us as an institution. And that's unfortunate. It doesn't have to be that way forever.
Right. And also on the flip side of that, the opportunity that we're missing out on.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, looking to the questions here. How about this one? A question related to board involvement with launching a planned giving during a pandemic. How can we leverage the leadership and contacts?
So I'm a fundraiser by background, but I will confess that I don't have a ton of expertise in planned giving. What I will say from my general knowledge of fundraising is I do think that that this is a moment where deepening relationships with those donors that are already connected to us as an organization or an institution is time really well spent. For some institutions, it is a tough time to try and reach out beyond our current network. That's not to say that you shouldn't, and that's not to say that there aren't organizations, you know, particularly those working on the front lines of the pandemic, or in this moment, front lines of the fight for racial equity, that are not reaching new donors in this moment. There absolutely are. But for those that feel like, you know, that's not as much the center of your work, it may feel like a tough time to be reaching out to new donors. And so the advice that I've been giving to organizations and their leaders is to really invest in relationships and communications with current donors. And that's exactly what a planned giving program is. It's about connecting to people who care deeply about your organization, so much so that they want it to be a part of their estate planning or end of life planning. And so this could in fact be a really opportune moment to talk with current donors about how they're thinking about your institution as a part of their estate planning. It's also a time where, because of all of the things that I already mentioned, that your fundraising staff team may feel like we don't have as much to do as we would like to, and therefore we have bandwidth to build new program and planned giving programs are programs that take a long time, not necessarily to build, but to to sort of come to fruition. And so it may be a good use of fundraising capacity from a staff perspective if you have it. The only caveat that I would make there is I think we sometimes overcomplicate planned giving because you don't have to be super expert in all of the different giving vehicles that planned giving can create, but you do need to understand it from a general framework. And so if you have team members who are leading that effort, who are not familiar with planned giving, they will need to spend a little time educating themselves about how to set up a new program. So that was probably a longer and more detailed answer than you were looking for, but those are my few insights from somebody who knows a little bit about planned giving, but not enough to advise.
Well, thank you, Anne. And along those lines, I had a client who is a little nervous right now because they are actually getting a lot of gifts at the moment, but they're wondering if people are moving up their gifts from year end to today. And what they're hoping is that these are special gifts because they need them, and they'd like to count on the gifts in the future. So how do you talk to boards or board members about making a special gift at this time in addition to their annual gift that they normally give?
I think with board members, you can be really, really direct about that. We're in a moment of need. We really hope that you will consider a special gift to us. This is a moment where we need you. Please give whatever you can. And we hope that you will still give your annual gift at the end of the year. I mean, I think the framing is somewhat similar to the way that we often talk to board members about capital campaign gifts versus annual gifts. So those of you who have gone through a capital campaign, I think it's similar in philosophy. I think the thing to be thoughtful about is how well do you understand the personal circumstances of your board members, and making sure that if somebody is in a tough situation themselves, if they've lost a job or spouse has lost a position, or certainly board members, many board members are in situations where their investment portfolio has taken a really big hit. So being direct but gentle and kind of acknowledging that folks may have individual personal circumstances that mean that they can't give as much as they would like to. And then I think, with board members individually, thoughtfully, gently, if they do make a special gift, thanking them, looping back with them and saying, as I said, I really hope you're still in a position to make your normal annual gift, but knowing whether or not that's possible is really, really helpful. And you can have, a gentle conversation about, is that a probably, a yes, a no, a maybe, so that you have a read on that. I think it's much more difficult to do that with others, particularly when you don't have relationships. So with your major donors, where you know them and you have relationships, I think you can do that when you think it's appropriate, if you know them well enough that you know that it is. But you want to tread carefully for all the reasons that I said, with board members. But it is tough because we in some ways need to be able to predict what the donor behavior is going to be, but this is a moment or a context in which predictions are really, really tough to make.
Thank you for that. I've got another question to get off of fundraising. How should the board evaluate the executive director's leadership in times of crisis and evaluate their own performance should it stay the same?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways that you could think about that. So there's probably not one answer. It's something that, you know, the board source board for ourselves has thought about in terms of my assessment. The board that I serve on, we've thought about that in terms of our assessment of our own performance and our CEO assessment. So I know these questions are on people's minds, and we're hearing it from folks across the board source network as well. I think this is not a business as usual moment. So if the reason that you're doing it is because we always do it and it's business as usual, that may not be enough of a reason to do it. That said, the experience of board self-assessment can sometimes be really clarifying and helpful in terms of motivating action. So if there's a board that's not engaged right now, that could actually be a really helpful tool for saying, here's the impact of this board not being engaged. And so it could be a helpful way to hold up a mirror and start a conversation that needs to happen. Differently, but not completely dissimilar. You know, for CEOs or museum directors, EDs, assessment or evaluation can be a really, really needed and helpful coming together around expectations. And it can be a really important moment for the board to express appreciation, both in what they say or write and in terms of compensation, if that's something that's a part of that evaluation process. So I would not assume, you know, as a board member that, you know, we shouldn't do the evaluation, because you could actually be exacerbating or creating tension and stress for the exec that you think you're alleviating. So I would just encourage boards to have conversation about it and not assume that you should do it, not assume that you shouldn't do it, and make an intentional choice that makes sense based on your context.
Great, and you are the expert there, so I'm not going to weigh in, so thanks for that. Another question that came in was actually a question, it looks like, referring to something that you had talked about before. You had mentioned capturing great ideas for the future. What process for capturing have you seen to be successful? A database, an Excel spreadsheet, or emails? I see our board sending a raft of emails with lists of ideas. It seems hard to manage. What works for you?
Yeah, I think it's really what works for you. So I think the advice that I would give is setting the expectation with the board that you are capturing them, and will come back to them at some point in the future, both as a way to be respectful of the good thought and the ideas that, you know, the thinking that went into the ideas, and to relieve you from the expectation of dealing with things that you can't deal with right now because you don't have the bandwidth to do it. So if it were me, it would be a folder in my email that I knew that I had all of those ideas there that I could come back to. Some people are whiteboard people, you know, that works too. I probably would recommend generally that you own this as the exec rather than creating a system that you're asking board members to input around, because one, it creates work for you or your team that you probably don't have the time to manage right now. And it also sets an expectation that this is something that you want the board to populate, which might be the exact opposite of what you're actually needing or signaling this in this moment. So I think it's sort of, we've all been in trainings where they've had, you know, parking lots where these are important things that we don't want to forget about and we want to come back to, but it's just not what we can be focused on in the context of this specific container, or this set of hours and time. And I think that's what it is. So whatever mechanism for keeping those things in that parking lot that works for you, I think is fine.
So one idea that I had, I'm a spreadsheet girl. So it would be a combination of the email folders, but also in a spreadsheet. And so in regular times, I actually worked with a client just on this, where we gathered, literally it was an exercise in gathering all the ideas, right? And we created a matrix. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but it was a matrix where we had kind of programs on the top, different ideas like, I think they were thinking about a capital campaign, just listing out all sorts of things, leadership, board, all that. So across the top. And then across the side, if you will. So how does it fit with mission? What is the financial impact? What are some further questions that we need? Is this something that we can do immediately? Long-term, short-term, medium-term. I like Anne's idea. Right now, we're in a crisis, and perhaps this is a save for later moment. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that you do the spreadsheet immediately, but it might be a tool that when things calm down, you can pull all those ideas out of the email folder and start to kind of categorize and prioritize based on different criteria. And again, that is a very high level answer to that question, because I could talk for a couple hours on that.
Let me just, if I may, jump in and add a thought, which is not specific to this question, but I think is a general bit of advice for executives in engaging with boards. I think sometimes as executives, it's really easy for us to kind of put things in front of the board, thinking that the response will be, oh, that's great, or oh, that's interesting, or I'm glad to know that. And sometimes that's how boards react, but often when we put things in front of boards, and I say this, sort of as somebody that works with boards and talks to executives and board members all the time, but also as somebody who is a CEO and who is a board member and knows how hard this can be. The message that we are unintentionally sending to the board is, I want you to engage in this. I want you to ask me questions about this. I want you to help me finish this. I want you to tell me why this is a good idea or why this is a bad idea, etc. And so if that is not what you're asking, be thoughtful about what you put in front of the board.
That's great. And, I think, Anne, correct me if I'm wrong, but you want to be very careful of the board's time. And so you want to be able to frame the question in, what is your expectation and what answer are you looking for? Are you looking for brainstorming? Because that's something different than just give me a yes or no answer.
Right.
All right, let's keep going. What do you think about launching into a capital campaign this year for building expansion? So capital campaigns in regular times are a lot. In my recent past, I used to teach day-long facility workshops talking about the impact on operations and budgeting and cash flow. And we would always bring in a fundraising consultant to talk about capital campaigns. So I'm not the expert. Anne's probably a little bit more of an expert than I am. But again, it depends. It depends on who you are, what you're doing. You may not have been affected by COVID, and your constituents and your donor population may not have been affected. Probably not true. Probably everybody's been affected in some way. And so to launch a capital campaign, like I said, in regular times it's a lot. And to do it under times of crisis is very difficult, but there may be an exception. So Anne, tossing it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that I was saying before about your donor base and if it's existing relationships and the nature of those relationships versus new relationships, I would pull through to this question. On top of that, and I know there's a lot of debate about feasibility studies and whether or not they are essential before a capital campaign. I think in this context, if I were on a board or a museum director thinking about a potential capital campaign, I would feel really uncomfortable moving forward if we hadn't had some level of engagement with our existing sort of leadership donor base about how they would feel about it. I think the risk is high that it could be perceived as misguided or tone deaf. That is not to say that I think that it is, but the risk of it being perceived that way is high, and you need to know how your top donors would feel about it. So I think that whether it's a formalized feasibility study where you use external consultants who do interviews with folks who would likely be lead donors or top donors, or it's putting out feelers with trusted relationships in your donor community, I think it's wise to put some feelers out before you go out with actual asks in this type of context.
Great, thank you, Anne. So next question, how do you manage internal board conflict in times of crisis? I'm thinking specifically about fiscal disagreements about tough decisions. And I'm curious for this anonymous attendee, if you could write just a little bit more about those fiscal disagreements. But Anne, maybe if you could start us off with just managing internal board crisis. And I think that kind of touches on maybe some of the other questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a moment where organizations are facing really big, tough decisions. And so I just want to start by acknowledging what I suspect are tough dynamics for this this questioner, this anonymous questioner, because so many organizations, and we've seen the headlines, just in terms of the number of organizations that either have already or are planning to or contemplating major staff layoffs. Certainly, we've already been hearing from organizations that are needing to dissolve, insolvent already. Unfortunately, just because of what we know, and NFF does amazing work in terms of your research on, how organizations are or really are not capitalized. We know that organizations don't have enough reserves to weather this storm if they don't have revenues coming in, or if they don't have revenues coming in at the same level. So we know that there is going to be more tough stuff coming. So with all of that, sort of acknowledged as context, it is understandable that boards are struggling with what does that mean we should do, and that there is a lot of emotion and intensity and sense of loss and fear around the types of decisions that boards are having to face. I think as executives and for board members that are on with us today, trying to be really clear-headed and calm about what you know is true in terms of your organization's purpose, and really centering on what is most important for us to do in service to that purpose. And I'm using that word intentionally instead of the organization and in the institution, because I think some organizations, and this is not me pushing this, but some organizations are in a place where they have enough time and money to think really strategically about what partnership, including mergers, could look like, that they won't have enough time and money for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months from now. And so thinking about, what's most important for us to do, and how do we organize around that, using that purpose and sense of shared understanding of what's most important to do as the North Star, and being really, really rigorously honest about what the numbers are telling you is possible. And acknowledging that that might mean some really, really tough decisions. From a tactical perspective, I think, acknowledging how much intensity and emotion is around that is helpful. Getting a chair who is willing to kind of navigate conversations in a way that says, we hear you, let's hear from someone else. That type of facilitation is really important in these conversations. That's tough to do in a virtual environment, because we're trying to facilitate adeptly via Zoom or teleconference, which is even harder, and being willing to call votes. So many boards are used to being able to operate by consensus, and that is wonderful when that happens. But I think, when you don't have time, the goal needs, and you've got urgent decisions of, existential levels of consequence, being willing to be focused on how do we make sure that we've heard everyone, that everyone has been able to surface, and do some collective sense making around what does this moment mean, and then being willing to call a vote. I think that's pretty important in a moment like this.
And I would just like to echo, because I didn't see any more comments coming in on the fiscal disagreements, but Anne, you did bring up, the potential for layoffs or furlough. Another question could be, do we use reserves, or do we, access the line of credit? There are so many different financial considerations here. That the only thing that I would offer is, to the extent that you can quantify each of your decisions so that you can see perhaps the impact that it might have financially on your organization, that should be a part of it. But you can't ignore mission or purpose, as you say, Anne, or the community that you serve, or the employees that you serve. So there is this balance, and it's not easy, but being the finance person, don't forget to quantify, because that can help us navigate in those difficult situations.
Yeah. And I know we're running very short on time, so we probably need to take one more question, and maybe we don't even have time for that. But just to add on to that, I could not agree more about the financial analysis, making sure that boards understand, however, that those are financial texture around scenarios that have assumptions behind them, rather than realities that are sure to happen, or even budgets, because they're not. They are sort of, if this happened, then it might look like this types of scenarios, and helping boards understand that, and being really, really rigorous and I guess in some ways tough-minded when the numbers just don't add up. Because the worst possible scenario is, at least from my perspective, is to be in a situation where you are so focused on success and what could be, what might be, what we all want to be, that you get in a situation where you just suddenly have run out of cash, and you cannot fulfill the commitments that you've made to your staff, and to everyone else who depends on or has trusted your organization and institution. And some organizations may be in that place already, and so thinking about what's the responsible way to think about that as a board. But that's a terrible way to end, so let's not end there.
And it's unfortunate, because this person did ask, give us some context. So let me eke it out. I know we have only 2 minutes left, but some board members feel married to traditional best practices of not touching the endowment principle, and others don't understand why we just don't close out our deficit with endowment and reserve funds. We did a round of layoffs before, drawing more from the endowment, and I think some board members privately, and I can't see the rest.
Wonder why.
All right. So really quickly on touching the endowment and trying to make that decision. And it's so hard when things are changing and everything is rapidly going. But one thing that I would just say is to have some sort of a plan for either how it's going to be paid back in the future. Like, how are you reconfiguring your business model, right? How are you not just going to keep drawing from the endowment until it's to zero, right? So we want to give our board members confidence that there is a turnaround plan. It might look completely different than the way you're operating today, but we need to, or maybe this is the time to unwind. And, that's a whole nother discussion. Anyway, it looks like we're done. And thanks so much
Thank you, Alice. Thank you to all of you for being with us. We appreciate the conversation. We appreciate the work that you're doing in your important institutions and for your important missions. We wish you the best of luck with the big challenges that so many of us are facing with our organizations. And we're here for you as organizations. So please feel free to reach out to Nonprofit Finance Fund, to BoardSource. Both of our websites have lots of resources, you know, in general and for this moment of crisis in particular. So please don't be a stranger. We're here to help.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you for doing the great work that you do. This is not easy to navigate at all. We're all learning kind of on our feet, if you will. I do want to put a plug in for BoardSource. Their Ask the Expert website is amazing. It's by topic, and the answers to those questions are very, very thoughtful. So head on over to BoardSource for additional information.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks to you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this session today, and we are now going to be ending our broadcast. Have a great day, everybody.